Lewis was the first one to help me grapple with the big questions. That book, The Problem of Pain, he described how he used to argue against the Christian faith. And here's what he said. Here I am, this brand new Christian, and I'm listening to what this guy says. Not many years ago, Lewis says, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, why do you not believe in God? My reply would have been, look at the universe we live in. History is largely a record of crime, war, disease, and terror. The universe is running down. All stories will come to nothing. All life will turn out in the end to have been a transitory and senseless contortion upon the idiotic face of infinite matter. If you ask me to believe that this is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. And I go, whoa, wow, that's a powerful argument. But what I loved about it is, think about this. Has Richard Dawkins ever said anything more persuasive than that? This is why we've got to help our young people hold C.S. Lewis's hand and walk through the problem of evil and suffering way before they get to college, even before they get to high school. They've got to work this through, because otherwise they're going to have some professor who's going to bring up for the first time the problem of evil and suffering. No, that should be dealt with all along the way and much earlier, and by sympathetic people like C.S. Lewis, because their college professors are not going to normally be sympathetic. And honestly, many of them will be, well, virtually all of them will be intellectual pygmies compared to Lewis. But nonetheless, let's take them somewhere where they can get some good grounding in dealing with these serious problems, which the Bible does. How long, O Lord? The problem of evil and suffering is developed in Scripture, and it's answered. But the great thing is, Lewis had turned to the Christian faith because he believed that it had greater explanatory power by far than his atheism did. This fed me. This bolstered me. This allowed me to speak up more boldly as I'm sharing with my friends this new faith. All my friends at that time were unbelievers, and they couldn't believe what was happening with me. A couple of years ago, I reread The Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed, one right after the other. The Problem of Pain is more reasoned and logical. A Grief Observed contains all this raw suffering because it was written after the death of Joy Lewis, his wife for just 4 years when she had died of cancer. And Lewis's grief is so palpable, it's so raw, it's so overwhelming. But those two books beautifully complement each other, contrary to one of the movies called Shadowlands. There's two movies about the life of Lewis, both called Shadowlands. One was a BBC production, which for the most part is more accurate. Then there was the more Hollywood version of Shadowlands, where Lewis is played by Anthony Hopkins. Just to clarify, this is a movie in which Anthony Hopkins doesn't eat anyone. He plays C.S. Lewis. He's this ivory tower professor who knows nothing about suffering, supposedly. And then, when Joy dies of cancer, it portrays him as doubting what he had earlier written in The Problem of Pain. Well, at the movie's end, those of you who've seen it will remember this, Lewis sits down in the attic next to his young stepson, Douglas Gresham. And Doug Gresham is the one who you saw in the video last night who introduced this conference. And over the years, the real life Doug Gresham has become a friend. And we have discussed this false portrayal of Lewis as not knowing suffering until Joy's death. I think it's important to clarify this in contradiction to the movie, the real life story. Because in Surprised by Joy, Lewis tells of the death of his mother when he was only 10 years old. He says this, "With my mother's death, All settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. There was to be no more of the old security. It was all sea and islands now. The great continent, like Atlantis, had slid under the waves. In boarding schools, Lewis was abused by bullies. One of those boarding schools had a headmaster who was actually declared insane. As a young man, Lewis was on the battlefields of World War I, this terribly vicious, bloody war. He was hit by shrapnel in 3 places. One of those was so close to his heart that it was never removed. By age 19, Lewis had seen dozens and dozens of comrades who had become friends slaughtered in battle. For years, Doug Gresham says, Lewis suffered terrible nightmares about being back in the trenches. This is all by age 19, this man who had known no suffering, right? No, he knew suffering. Of course, the suffering with Joy was another level of suffering in her loss, but he was alienated from his disapproving father, though he was phenomenally popular with students at his Oxford College, Magdalen. They never offered him a full professorship or an academic chair. That came later with Cambridge. They resented his Christian faith. He spent many years caring for Mrs. Moore, who was this demanding and hypercritical mother of a friend who had died in the war. He had the daily burdens of letter writing, various ailments, and his brother Warnie's alcoholism. All of this took its toll. So, the problem of pain is not a naive, unrealistic perspective of someone that was ignorant about true suffering. In it, Lewis said this: God, who has made us, knows what we are and that our happiness lies in him. Yet, we will not seek it in him as long as he leaves us any other resort where it can even plausibly be looked for. While what we call our own life remains agreeable, we will not surrender it to him. What then can God do in our interests but make our own life less agreeable to us and take away the plausible sources of false happiness? A profound analysis. Suffering can be the road to transforming grace, and Lewis walked that road. And many of us, I hope most of us, are in the process of walking that road. Not that I want us to suffer, just knowing that life brings suffering. So is it going to be a suffering that is used by God in his grace to transform us?